Callie, are you hearing that background noise before we get kicked off?
I am. I'm not really sure where it's coming from.
Okay.
It's not too loud, but it does just sound like maybe a computer or a fan of a computer sitting close to someone's microphone.
Okay.
I'll keep it
go. Are we good, Callie?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay. Welcome everybody to today's Q&A webinar on behalf of BASA, OSBA, and OASBO. We're glad that you're here, and we're especially thankful for our work group members who have obviously invested the last 3 years of their lives in developing the Fair School Funding Plan, but also their preparation to get ready for today's webinar. So thank you all for submitting questions, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our work group members who will really be running the show today.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to the associations for hosting this follow-up webinar. Today's a little different. It's not as scripted and polished as last Friday's statewide webinar. We wanted to follow up and respond to questions that have been received, and thank you so much for using those links through your associations and submitting those questions to us. Today's purpose and overarching goal is for you to have the opportunity to engage with the work group members, practitioner to practitioner, either through your submitted questions or live, so you can actually talk to the architects who put this plan together over the last 3 years. It has taken many twists and turns, but we're super excited about being here today with a substitute House Bill 305 and a companion to that in the Senate with overwhelming support in both the House and Senate. But that's the last cheerleading that I'm going to do about that today, because what I do want to do is set the stage for an interaction amongst our members to learn as much as you possibly can about this bill, the mechanics of it, the interaction between the 3 steps that we've highlighted. So I'm going to set the stage, and then we're going to right into the Q&A. At a high level and very simply laid out, this formula is comprised of 3 parts. Base cost, step 1. Step 2 is the interaction between the state and local, or the distribution. And step 3 is the add-ons or categoricals and those additional resources that are needed across the state. They take on different shapes and sizes and different priorities. And if you've had a chance to read the bill language, you can see how those priorities are laid out. We're going to construct our Q&A aligned with the steps 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to ask our work group members to answer accordingly. Tomorrow's call to action is quite a bit different. So our members today, again, will be answering your questions in detail and talking about the construction. And if we're not able to answer those questions, we'll follow up with you. We'll follow up with you through the education associations, through FAQ documents posted to the Fair School Funding website, now live. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. So we're going to go through the recorded questions first, and I'm going to kick off with my co-chair, Tom Hostler, the first few questions. The first few questions are related to base cost. What does it cost to educate a student in this new formula compared to the $6,020 that's in the current formula? As you've had a chance to look at the bill language and the detail LSC simulation language, you'll see that this is a variable base cost. And we talked about averages in the last week's presentation, that when the simulations were run, on average, the state of Ohio now raises to about $7,000, $7,200. But if you look into the details of the bill language, it's actually a variable base cost because it's determined on that student to class ratio that Tom does the run through in the base cost. And so while it is very variable, the average base cost is about $7,200.
Ryan, we had a couple people in the chat ask if they should be seeing a different slide.
We're not going to share additional slides. This slide's going to stay up for the majority of the presentation, but we're not going to shuffle back and forth between those. The next question. Do we have another question on the panelist? The next question, I believe I understand the general concept of how the base cost is determined. How will the weights in these categories be determined or divided? Just like wealthy districts have capacity and lower districts have capacity to pay for lower wages. In other words, their cost of living business is less. So one of the concepts that we were asked in testimony was the concept of equity. Well, the concept of equity and the components are baked into every step of this process. Let's relate it to base cost. Base cost, and what you don't see on the base cost calculator, is an average teacher salary and benefits. And different from previous funding attempts and before, that average teacher salary is around $65,000 plus the additional benefits. And so we talk about the regional cost of doing business factors or equity components about that. Think about our more suburban and urban or population dense areas. They may have higher wages, but compare and contrast that to less population dense areas, more rural areas that now in a base cost formula have an average teacher salary that's used to compute the base cost of around $65,000 plus benefits. That is, in a sense, an equitable distribution that's baked in to those formulas. And that concept resonates all the way through the student-teacher ratio component, the social emotional health and wellness component, the superintendent and treasurer components. Those averages are set to a higher level than what some of our more rural school districts can attract and retain. Tom,
and Ryan, if I could jump in.
Please.
Yeah, if I could jump in for a second. I think one of the things that we really wanted to do is to answer that fundamental question of what does it cost to educate a typical student, and really come at it from almost a purist perspective, where we just wanted to answer that question. And one of the challenges that we have with our current formula is it's been distorted through different ways. Over the last decade or more, things have been done to it to get different results, and that has bent it and distorted it. With the base funding model, what we tried to achieve as a group is to keep that pretty much pure, just answering that essential question. And when you look at the base cost work, I think we've tried to, I think we were successful in doing just that. So if we began to adjust it for this or for that, or move in, from this region to that region, all of a sudden we're distorting that base cost, that ultimate question that we were setting out to answer. And the other components that we'll talk about are areas where you will see those kinds of additions and things that will make a difference in those different types of districts. So that's one of the things that we heard questions about that before, and that was, well, why don't we change this with the base cost to get this outcome? And we really didn't want to. We wanted this to be kind of a pure approach, something that we can build on in future years, or with different components that we'll go over as we go through this presentation, answer different questions. So I think I just wanted to share that we've heard that before, and there's ways to accomplish that you'll see as we get into the Q&A. But for us, this is that sound footing as we move forward.
Thanks, Tom. we received a number of questions, quite a few actually, as it relates to capacity, the state local share, which is listed on your screen there as number 2. And now we're going to turn that over to our 2 co-chairs, Michael Hanlon, who's the superintendent at Chardon, and Jared Bunting, who's the treasurer at Trimble. Michael and Jared, do you want to run through your questions?
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And just talking about a few questions that we've received. One had to do with, in a particular school district with fixed revenue levies on the books, emergency levies, if you will. If there was a variation in one of the capacity components, whether it be property valuation going up or down, or anything with the 2 income components, would that in any way affect the overall revenue that would be generated from the district in those fixed term levies? And the answer to that question would be no. Those would continue to generate the revenue that they are generating for the district, and those capacity measures would be independent of any local levies that are raised. And I think that's an important component that Tom also raised here, is that we're really talking about a funding mechanism that is funding that typical child in the state of Ohio, but it doesn't remove the ability of a district to determine what it wants to add on and feels is appropriate within their particular community through additional levies to support the level of education that they wish to provide in their community. Jared?
Thank you, Michael. I know there's quite a few things out here, some simple ones that we'd like to hit on, such as what years are we using in these simulations for our valuations? And that obviously that's a fairly easy one. We're using 2019 property valuations and 2018 adjusted gross income numbers. Those are obviously important if you're ever going to try to go back and tie numbers back in. And we also have some other ones talking about understanding the relationship between local share and an increase in property values. The total property valuation comprises 60%, as we've covered several times, and an increase in the property valuations over time will cause the district to have a higher capacity. And this would allow for an increased level of local revenue to be gained. But then it can also be tempered with the 40% on the income capacity on whether that is also increasing at a similar rate, which will help prevent an over-reliance on the property taxes.
Jared, can I stimulate some further conversation in that area, specifically related to some of the questions that we were asked in testimony? So we have a number of districts, whether it be pipeline values, whether it be public utility, and the variations. And we now have a formula that recognizes those changes in more live time, but is also built in protections, if you think about it, as public utility or values come and go, a district's relative wealth gets adjusted. And it gets adjusted in a much more fluid fashion. So you could maybe walk us through that a little bit more.
Yeah, with this being not frozen, similarly to how we are now, where your value is set for a 2-year period, we're able to recognize these changes year to year, which will keep us from having those larger chunks of changes in our funding. Because as we know, public utility has a tendency to depreciate over time rather than appreciate, as most other valuations do. We're going to capture that year over year and be readjusting the local share each year as those numbers drop or increase depending on what's happening in your local district. And that holds true with more than just obviously the PUP. It's across the board, and we're doing it the same way with your income. And by using an average and a median factor on the income, it helps us smooth out some of the large chunks that you could have, because we did have the question coming from Southeast Ohio with the pipelines on where these leases are bringing in a lot of additional income to the residents, which is potentially raising their median income. But you have to look at that median range to find out, did this really move the needle at all with it being the median? Because the people getting those leases may have already been above that median number, which means nothing changed. So you have to look at it more than just on the surface. You have to dig in a little bit more to make sure that you're getting the understanding of what these changes could cause year over year.
Great. And you guys, Michael and Jared, you have a number of other questions. So we're gonna sit here for a little while and talk about this step 2 distribution component. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm gonna ask some of those questions to follow up. The simulation notes reflect a guarantee of FY20 levels and obviously pre-COVID reduction. Can you walk us through the guarantee language that's included?
Yeah, it is freezing us, as you said, at the pre-COVID levels. So it's the FY19 number with the adjustments made to the transfers, your open enrollment, your community schools, your vouchers from FY20. That's where we're coming up with that FY20 guarantee. So we're guaranteeing everybody at that level that they cannot drop below that. And then moving forward, the bill language does make a note to moving the guarantee amount ahead years as we're moving out. Off the top of my head, I do not know the specific language on what years are getting guaranteed as we move forward, but there is language in there doing that.
Great. We've had a number of questions regarding wealth in pipelines. And it asked specifically if the new Fair School Funding Plan calculates as written and incorporates those values. How are those values recognized into this formula?
It is my understanding that those values are recognized in the same way that they are now. That would be a policy decision that would need to be addressed at a later time. That's, well, not necessarily at a later time, but is not in current language in the proposal now. There are obviously things that could be updated if it's determined by the legislature that they want to make amendments to the proposal. However, that's one that is staying as current law in that regard when it comes to determining the valuations.
On that question alone, because we did have a number of questions regarding that, I'm going to ask Mike Sobel to join in a little bit and ask you, Mike, if you've had any additional thoughts or conversations with individuals on pipeline values regarding this relative wealth calculation.
The main issue that's really come up, and it is an open issue to be talked about, is deals around the challenges by Rover and Nexus, because the valuations that are being used right now are the ODT certified valuations, which do not reflect the challenges that those two companies have done. So in a way, it is overstating the wealth of districts with those who have pipelines of those two companies. And I think that is something, it probably needs to be a temporary fix if it's in there, but it is something that probably needs further discussion. And yeah, and I have had some discussions about that issue and wealth in general, not just even related just to House Bill 305 and House Bill 376, but even if we had the old formula, it would still be the same issue, is how that's being dealt with.
Thank you. And we're going to pause here for just a minute. I do want to recognize the chat. We have chats coming in as well as Q&A sections. And thank you for Katie. Looks like Katie is posting a lot of the resources that are available from the Legislative Service Commission, bill detail and fiscal notes. And so I know we're going to be talking a little bit more after our categorical teams come up here next to talk through the other questions that we received, lots of them being around, I would like to see some additional simulations, Excel, and those calculations. Jared, Michael, any other questions that we didn't incorporate into some of your answers that you'd like to highlight now before we move on to categoricals?
No, I think those were the main ones that I saw in the Q&A.
Okay, great. All right, still up on your screen is the steps 1, 2, and 3. We've talked about base cost. We've talked about the details with the state local share. Not that we can't go back to that, but we are going to move on to the categoricals. And I'm going to kick off the categoricals this way. The majority of questions that we received regarding categoricals had to do with the counting of students. Remember, this is a funded where educated plan. And so we received a lot of questions on open enrollment and what impacts that has. And so to that, I'd like to introduce Steve McAfee, the treasurer. Now you're no longer at Whitehall, right, Steve? You're
correct. Logan L, Pickaway County.
And superintendent from Forest Hills, Scott Prebles. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you two to walk through your questions.
Thanks, Ryan. Before I get into a few of the questions, I think I'd like to preface the subgroup that Scott and I were a part of, looked at open enrollment, community schools, and vouchers. So the school choice programs. And the underlying theme when it comes to these choice programs in our recommendations is that we want to count and fund where educated. Count and fund where educated. And I think if you keep that concept in mind, it answers a lot of the questions. Because what we're trying to do is untangle the funding of those programs from the traditional district so we can make sure that the students that you are educating are funded fairly and everything is transparent. You don't have the smoke and mirrors of money coming in and going out of your formula. We're trying to make this fair and rational and transparent. So the questions that I saw, and I'm going to address 4 of these, and if Scott's on, he's welcome to jump in here. A couple of these were asked a few times. The first one I wanted to address is there were a few questions about column I on the simulations. And column I was called estimated formula aid net of transfers, current law. And you were comparing that to the proposed fully implemented Fair School Funding Plan projection. And Jared touched on this a little bit, but I want to get a little more specific about it, especially for the treasurers out there, because I know when we can't tie a number out, it drives us crazy, right? So the best way that I found to kind of confirm that number is if you take your fiscal year 2020 June number 2 SFPR and you start with your foundation formula funding, which is line A, you add back in state funding reduction due to COVID, like Jared said, add that back in. Add in your enrollment growth supplement if you get it, which is line C. Add your open enrollment adjustment. If you're a net gainer, that's going to increase your number. If you're a net loser on open enrollment, that's going to bring it down. Add your community school transfer, which is line J. Of course, that's a negative number for everybody because that's a one-way street. So if you're adding a negative number, you're subtracting technically. Same with the STEM school transfer, line K. and the scholarship transfer. And I tested that for every district in the state on the spreadsheets. And over 90% were within a percent, and most of them were a fraction of a percent. But there were a few that were a little more off. So we checked with LSC to see why that may be. First off, that's not entirely uncommon if you've dealt with these simulations from LSC before, because it always depends on at what point in time the data is being pulled from. And some of the data, we may not be using the same data that they are. But one of the reasons that may be off is because they build a little inflation into the scholarship amounts because those have been trending upward over the years. So they were looking at more at a current number for scholarship amounts. If you have a lot of scholarship and deduction on your SFPR, that number may have assumed to be bigger. They said also if you have open enrollment preschool students, that could affect it because that will continue to be a deduct and transfer for preschool students that are open enrolled. So those may be some of the reasons for the discrepancies. But I found that formula that I just rattled off gets you pretty darn close. And the key thing here is some people didn't think their incoming open enrollment revenue was included in column I. And I want to assure you that it is. And so far, Mike Sobel hasn't objected to anything I say, so I must not be too far off there.
Just like we rehearsed it, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Scott.
So if you're a superintendent on my side of that coin, what does all that mean? So regarding the open enrollment, basically, as I understand it, a pool of dollars or resources would be established with the following financial parameters for open enrollment. Because the goal is not to have significant windfalls or to have significant reductions in anybody's budget. The goal of this calculation was to try to keep people held harmless for the most part. So a school that loses a student to open enrollment would forfeit the difference between their base cost share and the new funding number of $7,195. And a school that gains a student will receive the difference between their base cost share and $7,195. So that's the calculation if you're sort of a lay person like myself trying to figure out kids coming in and kids coming out. And remember where Steve started. The goal is to fund children where they're educated, and therefore that doesn't show up on your ADM. Those students go to the other location.
Steve, Scott, thank you. One of the questions embedded in our spreadsheet that we received was regarding Ed Choice scholarships. Can you walk through that component of your subcommittee? And I think we just received a question online, not to break ranks here on constructing how we're going to go through the Q&A, but I do think we had a question on the spreadsheet as well.
Well, again, as far as the Ed Choice scholarships would be concerned, those would be funded directly. So those would no longer pass through your SFPR or whatever the new funding statement would be called. Those would be funded directly and paid 100% by the state, and there would be no effect on your funding. Your funding would remain pure in terms of the kids that you are educating.
Great, thank you. Steve, Scott, before we move on to other categoricals, were there any other questions, or did you hit the majority of those?
I think I just, if I can, just touch on two more quick things, Ryan. Another question that we had received was about non-resident students of employees, and would those be included in ADM? Well, they are included in Formula ADM today, and they would continue to be included in, I think, what we would refer to as enrolled ADM under the Fair School Funding Plan. So I wanted to answer that. And then the other question, we've been saying all along that we're trying not to change the incentive for accepting an open enrollment student, right? But sometimes people want a little more specific answer than just to trust us on that. And I think the key is to look at that distribution formula. And I kind of tested it out myself yesterday, playing with my own district's numbers. Because when you add a student to your enrollment, that's going to bring down your per pupil amounts, your valuation per pupil, your income per pupil. So it all becomes a wash with your local share. And you wind up realizing the full base cost and categorical amounts that open enrollment student is generating. Now, it's not necessarily a perfect system, because if I'm not mistaken, I think the distribution uses prior year enrollment, where the base costs and categoricals would use current year funding. So it may take a year for you to realize that full amount. But I think if you look at that distribution, you'll see how you're capturing the full amount for that open enrollment student. And that also has been confirmed by analysis by LSC. So we're pretty comfortable with how we're handling open enrollment with this new formula.
Great, thank you. We're now going to move on to the other categoricals. And again, as I mentioned, the majority of those questions that we received were in those areas. So I'm just going to go through the subgroups listed on your screen now. And I'm going to make sure that we have an opportunity for you to see the co-chairs of these committees, and also a quick opportunity for those co-chairs to hit the highlights or differences of their committee. So first up, I do want to talk about poverty in preschool. Claudia Zahler is the treasurer CFO of Waverly City Schools, Waverly Local, I'm sorry. And Doug Ute, who wasn't able to join us today, was a superintendent at Newark at the time. And Claudia, we did get some testimony in this week with your subgroup. And I think one of the most important parts is the priority that the Fair School Funding Plan puts on poverty. So could you walk us through a couple points there as it relates to that priority that's inherent throughout this bill?
In the original bill, the additional cost of $150 so the base cost currently is $272. We were raising it $150 to make it $422. Originally, that was going to be a phase-in process. There were some concerns in related to that being phased in, and we wanted to make sure that poverty schools were a priority. So in the new Senate Bill 376 and Sub-House Bill 305, we fully implement that 422 upfront. We also are asking them to fund the study that was approved on how to properly identify the exact dollar amount, what it takes to educate a student in poverty. And that would, once that study is completed, we would obviously adjust the formula for that amount, but the 422 is a placeholder that brings us closer to the 30% of additional base cost.
That's great. It is a huge priority. So it's first dollar funding in this plan now that's fully funded up front. And thanks, Claudia, and thanks for your testimony this week. Next, we have Jenny Logan, who's treasurer CFO of Lakota Local Schools. And Michael Barnes, I don't see him on a panelist today, superintendent from Lakewood Schools. And Jenny co-chaired special education, gifted, and ELL. And if you could do the same and hit the high points and or any questions that were recorded.
Sure, thanks, Ryan. So as you mentioned, we had 3 different categoricals that we dealt with in our subcommittee. The first was special education. The big piece, when I look at our recommendations in the part of the Fair School Funding Plan that has to do with special ed, it is to fund special education at 100%. Currently, it's at 90% and has been for a long, long time. We're recommending funding at 100%. That additional 10% would be set aside to help fund our catastrophic costs. currently those catastrophic costs, and any treasurer out there knows that lovely process that we have to go through to submit those claims. But the claims that come in, there's about 45 million statewide that's available for catastrophic. This would more than double the amount that's available for catastrophic. The coverage last year for the claims with that 45 million was only 27%. So we definitely need more money there. We're also recommending to go back to a multiplier of the base instead of a per pupil amount for the 6 categories with special education. And we are asking for a cost study to be done for special education, just like it was done for gifted, for special education. For gifted, there was a cost study that was done, and we are recommending that those different categories that were identified in that gifted study be funded. We're also asking for around financial transparency because we believe that during that gifted cost study, there were more than 40 districts statewide that showed that they did not have any gifted expenditures, and we know that that's probably not accurate. And so we want to look at what we want more financial transparency, and we want to make sure that our true investment in gifted education is reported. So we're recommending that a work group be put together that would look at how could we do that in a better way. English language learners, we are recommending, just like special education, that we go back to a multiplier of the base. And the other big thing with ELL is we are recommending, there's 3 categories that were funded there. We're recommending that we revise category 2 and category 3. Category 2 would be for all students enrolled more than 180 days until they achieve proficiency. And then category 3 would go along with our federal mandate now, which says we have to follow students 2 years after they exit ELL. So we're recommending that category 3 be for that portion. So that's kind of going through that. The only Q&A question that I saw submitted for our subgroup was regarding excess cost and the paperwork that goes back and forth between the districts to capture that excess cost in SF 14H. And in speaking to ODE and Aaron Roush, when we were going through this process, that was one of the things that we discussed. And there would be some type of a process that would be in place for that. So we would still have to go through a process. Don't know exactly what that would be, but we do believe we would need to still have that in place. That's it.
Thanks, Jenny. As we transition to the next subgroup, we did want to encourage our panelists to take a look at the chat and the Q&A and start to answer those questions, since we're transitioning to that portion where we're going to take more questions live. But we have a couple more subgroups to finish here. The next, and congratulations and retired, Jerry Brockway, who is the superintendent of Ashtabula County Career and Technical Center, and Treasurer Chief Financial Officer Carrie Herringshaw at Penna Career Center. And could you highlight the major changes for you and any questions submitted?
On the career tech side, the bill as introduced remains the same in the sub-house bill. So focusing on the base aid, similar to base aid for K-12, exchanging some of the components that don't really match for career tech centers. For instance, co-curricular activities, including athletic director, would not apply to a career tech center, but replace it with career assessment, program placement, recruitment orientations, things like that. So while the base cost is calculated the same way, the components aren't exactly the same, but we have other components that that apply instead. And again, that is not changing from the as introduced. Again, modifying the pupil-teacher ratio while students are in their career tech lab. It's 18:1 for safety reasons, for just a number of reasons related to if you're in a career tech lab and, you know, having fewer students to provide proper instruction and those kinds of things. That doesn't limit any lab to 18. It's just, again, it's not prescribed, but it's just the calculation for formulas. Continue to provide the career tech supplemental funding, also known as weighted funding, and that is recommended at current levels. So the weighted funding that we have now would translate to the new formula. The difference there would be changing from dollar amounts to percentages. So as the average base aid changed, we would see a change in the weighted funding annually. And then the one thing also, as introduced, career tech planning districts would receive money for career awareness education throughout the entire CTPD. And that would be $10 per student, and all students across the state would benefit from that. Jerry, do you want to address the ESCs?
Go ahead.
Okay. The ESC is different than the as introduced, and we had set up or made a recommendation that all ESCs would receive a base dollar amount consistent with the base aid, and that is the calculation for superintendent, treasurer, and other district-wide costs, and then additional dollar amounts for the number of students. And those dollar amounts were derived from a study that was done of 15 ESCs back in late 2017. We received the information in early 2018. And this is a temporary recommendation until a study by the Auditor of State's office is complete. But it does initially go into effect on day one. There's no phase-in. And once the study is complete, then a permanent recommendation would be made. And all ESCs would benefit from this immediate implementation of the recommendation. And there was a question in the chat about when the ESC simulations would be available. And we are in the process of waiting for an answer any minute now. If it comes through on this webinar, we'll post it. If not, we'll make sure that that information gets out ASAP. And we know you're anxiously awaiting for that. So we'll get that to you as soon as we can.
Great. Thanks, Carrie and Jerry. And I thanks to the work group members who are logging into the chat, into the Q&A, starting to answer some of those questions. We have 2 more subgroups left. We're going to now turn to technology. We've got the Superintendent of Worcester City Schools, Michael Tefts, and Treasurer Chief Financial Officer Cajun Keaton from Benton Carroll Salem. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that. This will be the quick and the easy one for everybody here today. Yeah, and Cajun, he certainly did most of the heavy lifting here on this, but we owe Jeff Andrews at the Management Council some significant props, because from a technical aspect, he was an absolutely terrific resource for this subcommittee. The technology subcommittee, what's great about designing a brand new formula is we currently do not fund directly any sort of technology in our current formula. So as we were trying to determine what does it take to educate a student in the state of Ohio, we wanted to build a formula that did try to take into consideration some of our expenses around technology. So this would flow through base cost. And we right now have a formula that is $68.50 per student per year. And it's based on that we would be replacing equipment every 4 years. So where did we come up with $68.50? Cajun, you want to highlight the details there?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Tefts. Appreciate your work on this as well. But, one of the things to keep in mind when we're talking about this is not prescriptive, right? So definitely want to keep that in mind when I'm going through these amounts. $37.50 would fund a Chromebook with a 4-year cycle. $3.50 would fund maintenance, replacement, and access points. $2.50 for maintenance, replacement, network switches, and things like that. And then $25 finally for essential functions, ITC, and third-party services for fiscal, student information management softwares, EMIS, things like that. Also, the only thing I think we didn't anticipate, because Mr. Tefts and I got done with this part of the work group pretty quickly, is Zoom, which I'm sure a lot of districts could probably utilize today. But we feel very confident and received excellent feedback going through this.
Great. Thank you very much. And I do see from Carrie and Jerry's update, I see that Will has forwarded the ESC simulations. Will, if you're still on, could you forward those or post those to the chat, please? And then finally, the subgroup, transportation. Last but not least, we've got Treasurer Chief Financial Officer Kevin Lilly from Geneva City Schools and Dalton Summers, Superintendent of Riverview Local Schools. Gentlemen?
Well, as some of the other subgroups mentioned, we relied heavily on Pete Chapixi and his vast knowledge of school transportation. But I would point out that we have made a lot of recommendations, and so have some of the other groups. But at some point, this does become political and subject to what the legislature believes they can swallow in terms of funding. So a number of our recommendations may not be fully implemented, but we are happy to report that as we fought through this process, that a lot of the transportation recommendations are now included. We've tried to raise that base funding for transportation that has been decreased down to 25% or state share percentage. And it looks like we're going to get that up to 50% or state share. And a number of other things that are in the bill to give money to particular instances of districts that have to transport a lot of charter school students, non-public school students, and so on. I think one of the only questions that we saw in the spreadsheet was from Cleveland Municipal, who had asked what the responsibility of districts was going to be for transporting students. There's really no change to that. What's in law is still the case. But the second part of that question had to do with the weights and how they work attributed to charter school students and non-public students. Again, there we had studies that were conducted by Pete Chapixi, and thank all the districts that participated and gave him the information he needed to complete those. He did one in 2017 and one in 2019 that showed that the cost of transporting charter school students was about 2.5 in 17 and 3.5 times in 19 the state average, and the non-publics was 3.5 in 17 and 4.5 in 19. So far, all we've been able to get in the bill, get the legislature or the bill writers to commit to is a 0.5 weight and a 1.0 weight for charter school students and non-public. So that means that if the average per writer funded in the formula was $1,000, then for each charter school student, there will be an additional $500 for a total of $1,500 per charter school writer. And then an additional $1,000 or $2,000 for that non-public writer. So a little more money there. We also were able to get the special ed amount increased, as we've seen no increase in the special ed set aside since 2009. So there should be more dollars directed to special ed transportation. And also a big change in the bus purchase allowance and more money directed to that. We don't really know at this point the methodology. I'm afraid it may currently be in this bill as it was in House Bill 166, but we have been trying to get that changed to a flat dollar grant amount. Originally it was 50,000. It looks like in order to replace 1,500 buses a year, it might be 30,000, but we wanted this to go equally to every district for each bus, or how that district chooses to use that. Dalton, would you like to add?
Yeah. Am I unmuted or am I muted?
We can hear you. No,
you can hear me now.
we can hear you.
All right. Just to piggyback on that, I guess I'm going to give more of a general view. And maybe it was good that transportation was at the end, because I think you can use transportation to kind of tie in a lot of the advantage of what we're doing here, I guess. Just in the process in the last 3 years of working with just the transportation portion of this, if you'll look, what we've drawn, because we're actually putting a formula together or a funding plan together that actually has rationale to it and makes sense, it causes conversations to take place. It causes data to be pulled out. It causes people to start to see, or legislators specifically, to start to see, what do you mean you haven't had any money for buses in how many years? How many years has it been since we've had replacement money or dollars for buses? And we're already seeing dollars coming back to replacing buses. One of the things about transportation that we focused, basically, one thing about transportation that made it a little easier was we all know we have to transport kids to school, whether you're city, whether you're urban, whether you're rural like me, it doesn't matter. And every dollar we put into getting kids to school takes dollars out of what it takes to educate them while they're there. So we have from the beginning tried to push to keep the transportation funding separate and outside of the formula, not subject to guarantees and caps that have been there in the past. I believe we are still in that direction. We are under the assumption we are at this point. That was a huge gain, I think, that we're making right now. As Kevin said, going back to 50% on the funding, we were down to 25%. We had went from 60% to 25. So in this proposal, we're at 50. I mean, in 305 as it states right now, it does work its way back to 50%. We originally proposed the full 60, of course, but like Kevin said, there was a lot of, I do believe there's a lot of political opposition, or not, I don't know if opposition is the right word, but there's a lot of different landscapes out there. And we did notice, we tried to identify and stay with the things that every district, all districts have transportation issues as far as their funding is concerned. Mine might be the fact that I put 40,000 miles a year on a bus and go through 3 sets of tires a year on one bus. Whereas Akron City might be the number, and I don't know if it's about Akron, but it may be because of how many non-traditional or non-public school students they're having to transport outside of their own kids. So we kept all of our points of emphasis and we pretty much stayed true. I got to give Kevin a lot of credit. He is he does not sway. When we stayed in one direction, and he keeps me in that direction, and he's kept the whole group in that when it comes to transportation of what our original proposals were, and then it's paying off. But I guess that's the end of my sermon. But I guess what I'm saying is it is a good example of just through this process alone, we're already making changes without even having a new proposal in, because we're drawing a lot of things to attention that haven't been even realized for years. So that's my transportation summary.
Great, thank you so much. And as we transition to the Q&A, the chat, and then what we'll call like other funding considerations, we'll be directing some of these questions to the panelists, Mike Sobel, and then recording some for getting answers if we can't answer them today. I'll take a few of the ones that were written to us about the total price tag, I believe, is both in the submitted chat and recorded questions. The total price tag of the bill is just under $2 billion. And we do have a Q&A that we're going to be adding early next week to help superintendents, treasurers, and school board members facilitate that conversation with their local communities. And again, this is a reminder that this is a 6-year phase-in. The simulations that you receive are fully phased in simulation. So as if adopted today and implemented for July 1, the price tag would be just under $2 billion. But we have a 6-year runway to implement that. And there's good, robust discussion and hopeful conversation around how that can be done. And we'll be providing you some talking points in that area. One of the other funding considerations was when we'll receive additional LSC information on ESCs. And again, I believe we're going to be posting those simulations today. We'll get those out through the education associations and directing you to the Fair School Funding website. Another funding consideration question is, do the simulations include the governor's wellness dollars? So the way we've been addressing the wellness dollars, we believe that the Fair School Funding Plan is the transparent and efficient methodology for the 3 outlined steps on your screen. We believe that any revenues that are directed to the K-12 education budget are most effective through this formula. While that is a policy discussion, and we respect that, we encourage legislators in the General Assembly to take a look at the language that is embedded in Senate Bill 376 that talks about the social, emotional security and life supports and the robust decisions that or discussions we've had over the last 3 years about funneling those revenues through this formula, or at least interacting with them in the efficient manner that we've laid out. We received a number of questions, both on the chat today and in writing, and I'm going to solicit the support of Mike Sobel on this one, that has to do with calculations. Let me frame the question here because it is somewhat complicated. We've had requests for simulations in Excel spreadsheet on individual components and base cost, on individual components of distribution, on the categoricals, all of it. And I can tell you just from working with the Fair School Funding Work Group and seeing this some live time myself, there is a spreadsheet that exists. Obviously, that doesn't get released with each school funding attempt because it's so voluminous that you can't get it out the door electronically. There's lots of thought and consideration that goes into what line items to share. And before I turn it over to Mike, I would like to say, though, many of our questions that were received had to do with help me in identifying the additional wealth components and calculations into distribution, or help me identify the calculation and interaction of transportation as a categorical to the other. So I do believe that we will be having a conversation, maybe even this afternoon, with the sponsors of this bill about releasing further simulations and categorical details so we can provide some additional clarity around that. Mike, from your perspective in doing this a number of times before, can you walk us through that? Because I know there's some frustration around not having those details, but there's some realities there too.
Yeah, I mean, the basic reality is that the only people who have the full details and a full working spreadsheet of this is the Legislative Service Commission. None of us on the school funding work group who've worked with the school funding work group have that. You know, we have pieces we used as we were building this, but a lot of those pieces are obsolete now because they were using older data, because we've been doing this for 3 years. We started 3 years ago, so we have older data. LSC has the only version of this that matters, and they're restricted in what they are able to do, and that they are restricted by what the sponsors are willing to release. And that's what, as Ryan said, we're going to have a discussion with the sponsors about that a little later on this afternoon. And we're going to try and structure things to get out that will help people understand some of the components that go into this. I know there were a couple questions. Is there a spreadsheet we can plug this into or that into? The answer to that right now, again, for general release is no. There's not. Again, LSEs is the only one, and they're not going to release the entire thing. First of all, because no one's going to probably be able to understand it anyway to work with it and know how it works. And so I think we'll get there, and hopefully over the next few days to maybe next week is have a couple other spreadsheets that we're able to release that will go into more detail and give more of at least some of the results of each of the different pieces of the formula so that people can see them and they can see which ones are having the biggest impact on influencing where their revenue is headed under this.
Okay, as we shift to the Q&A and chat online, these questions are really not going to be in the same format that we had in terms of base cost, the distribution, and then the categoricals. So forgive me as we are going to jump around here a little bit, but I want to make sure that we answer as many of the questions in the chat as possible. The first is, of the total 1.9 billion cost, how will that be phased in? What does it look like? And of course, I'm summarizing here. In previous versions, as introduced, House Bill 305 talked about an even revenue adjustment over the 6 years. Senate Bill 376 allows for, and there's a recognition for the Senate Bill 376 that allows for revenues as they become available, but then has to be fully phased in by year 6. So it's a recognition that the global pandemic has on current revenue collections, and there's a reality to those revenues being available. I also do want to highlight that different from as introduced, there are funding priorities that are listed in the bill language, like what Claudia talked about. The next question was, in other words, does health and wellness funds, will they be absorbed into the overall school funding formula? And again, I'll ask my colleagues for help on this question. It is not a policy question for this school funding work group to assume that success and wellness funds will be rolled into this funding formula. Quite the opposite. The governor's made mention that these funds will remain permanent, but we wanted to show a mechanism in which these funds interact efficiently with this formula. And whether or not they remain inside or outside of this formula has yet to be determined and is not a part of this bill.
Yeah, Ryan, if I could jump in on that as well. And that's a great example of how this formula could work in the future. The governor obviously very interested in that social, emotional, the wellness, the well-being of students. And in the current formula we have, there's no way to push dollars in to help students in that way. So they create what they did, this separate account, and you have to keep track and you can spend it on these things. In the future, and what's good about the formula that we've created, in my opinion, is that there are now lines for social, emotional, student well-being, or technology, or any of those, from picking up students at the crack of dawn to when they log off at 11:59 p.m. from their school device. Everything is covered. So a future governor could say, I'd like to do more with technology. There is a way to do that inside the formula that doesn't have to disrupt everything. So it does, to answer the question, I think Ryan did a great job of that, but I just want to point out that in the future, if we have an administration that wants to do something like that, there is a scalable path to do that doesn't disrupt the entire or work outside the formula to dump money in to do something. So that would be a useful thing for us, I know, in keeping those kind of conversations happening with the administration.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm going to work backward through the Q&A and chat. There was a question both in the Q&A and the chat about auxiliary services. And let me read the question, but there's an excess cost component to this. I can widen this a little bit. Does this formula impact auxiliary services? Will those cease to exist as pass-through or go directly to non-publics? And under that, are excess costs obsolete under the formula, SF14s, college credit plus deductions? So we really have a number of categorical subgroups here that are referenced. So I want to give a chance for the special ed gifted and ELL, because I know that Jenny addressed that a little bit. And then also the open enrollment charters and vouchers subcommittee to answer that question a little bit.
Sure. And I went ahead and typed in the chat, but auxiliary funds, our 401 funds, we did not address that with this plan. So we're not recommending that's not part of this plan. As far as excess cost or SF14s, we believe there still would be a process, and we have discussed that with ODE as we were going through and formulating our recommendations for the plan. We did discuss that there would still need to be a process in place to capture that.
I agree with everything she just said.
Thanks, Steve.
You're welcome.
And I will just add the issue with the auxiliary services. The legislature a few years ago took the non-religious affiliated services and direct funded them. I believe that will not be able, even if everyone wanted it to, it will not be able to change, because in looking at things, I think that it's necessary to do that to not violate the U.S. Constitution on the separation of church and state, in that they cannot directly send state funds to religiously affiliated parochial schools. It's why when they send it through the school districts and they hire somebody, they're technically the school district's employee that is being paid, not the the auxiliary provider of services. So I think there's really not a chance for that to happen, even if we wanted it to.
Okay, I'm reviewing additional questions. The next is regarding distribution. When it's said that the 2019 property tax value is used in the estimate, is that the 2019 values paid in 2020? Maybe just before we talk about categoricals in the next part of the question, highlight what values are being used for the distribution calculation, because I do believe it's a little bit more complicated than just a single year value.
Do you want me to go ahead and answer that?
Yeah, I would say if you or Jared are still on the line.
I say it's right now it's drawn up to use the lower of the value per pupil based on the most current year or the most recent 3 years. So the simulations right now would be using the lower of either 17, 18, and 19, or just 19. And that's going to be moving forward. Keep in mind, if this does go into law and if it is funded, by the time these final determination is made of what the capacity is, they'll be using 18, 19, and 20, or 20, because there will be 2020 data available by the time these calculations are done. And that's the case with everything being used in here. It's not a static data set. It's going to be a live data set that's updating as updated data become available all through here.
Next part of that question are categorical aid items and transportation funding included in the LSC estimate, or will these items be in addition to the LSC? Mike, you want to handle that one?
Yeah, they are all of those are included in the LSC simulations and compared to those same things as they're funded right now.
I know we have about 5 or 6 open questions, the majority of which have been answered into the Q&A, and some are not questions. There is one recently posted that's here in the Q&A. So districts that have little increase or negative increases could be potentially telling their boards or taxpayers that they won't be getting an increase or a very little increase in state funding in the next year. I don't know if any member of the panel wants to take that one. I will tell at a high level, when we started this process 3 years ago, there were more than 80% of the districts that were not on a formula. So we had districts deep into the guarantee, and just as bad as this, we had quite a number on a cap. And it was difficult for those districts because as enrollment changed and funding mechanisms changed and revenue streams came, actually the number of those districts not on a formula increased. It didn't decrease. So we now have the vast majority of districts actually on a formula. And then so I would direct the writer of this to go and do deep dive review on your district's apples to apples comparisons. We've talked about a lot of concepts here, but when you look at the printouts, what it doesn't include is the discussions and assumptions regarding the success and wellness funds. It doesn't include the below the line deductions, which we've all grown accustomed to. It also doesn't include in the top of the simulations in red, it's prior to the budget reductions of the aggregate 3.7%. I don't know if any of the other committee members want to tie into that a little bit.
Yeah, Ryan, we're not saying, the simulations aren't saying, sorry, Carrie, that this is what you're going to look like in 6 years. We've taken a snapshot. If this were fully funded next year, this is what we're expecting we would see. And obviously there's always changes in that from LSC simulations to live data. But this would get recalculated every year of the phase in and determined based on how much the legislature is granting for appropriations during the budget cycle.
And that's what I was going to point out, that the simulations are assuming that everything is going to remain exactly the same as it is today 6 years from now. And we all know that enrollment changes, lots of other factors change, you know, the components related to distribution, those things will change. So that will all factor in. And so to say today, what you're saying, I'm getting to, that's what it's going to be 6 years from now. There's too many factors that come into play. And if everything stayed exactly the same and there were no changes whatsoever, which is not likely to happen, that would be the case. But again, like Ryan said, deep dive into your district, evaluate changes and projections and enrollment and all those kinds of things. And that will help.
And that's why I'm going to point to Dan Wilson's comment in the question and answer, where he's saying, you know, and we do this, we get so consumed with what does the printout show? What does the printout show? And what we want to stress is the concepts, and this is a fair approach to school funding. So, you know, I'm as guilty as the next person, but you know, try to take your eyes away from that number. Like Carrie said, there's so many things that will change. Focus in on the plan and the concepts, and I think that will help.
Oh, she muted herself.
You muted yourself, Jenny.
Sorry, that's what's gotten the work group members through this process, is just to not focus on the numbers.
All right, so looks like
I assure you that in my district, I went directly across the hall and did the same thing with our treasurer. But like Jenny said, and what Tom had said earlier, as we navigate through the next few years, if we have a funding model that is easy to understand and the concepts are easy to understand, at least how money is to be distributed and for what reasons, and we can look at those columns throughout those years and be able to make sense of that, I think it will be helpful to all of us. So the big concepts here are really, really important. And I think that's the pureness of the work, was to try to develop something that was easier for us to understand, that was more equitable as far as access to quality education is in the state of Ohio, and being able to define that. That's what the purpose of this was. And as it continues to grow, it's a little bit harder to understand, but the basic concepts are there. And I think that's what's so important with this.
Great. I'm going to keep my eyes on the chat. The majority of the questions are coming in there, and ask the panelists to just jump in on these. Next question is, during the phase-in, would money for open enrollment dollars and other students that are educated at a district other than where they live, such as a community school, students and the like, be phased in as well? For example, if a district is getting $2,000 per pupil per student and losing the current 6,020, is there any, posing that as a question, some immediate help in that area?
Steve McAfee's concept, the idea was not to incentivize in any way that would be harmful. The idea here is to try to monitor this and watch this closely and have no significant winners and losers. As far as the calculation is concerned there, I think Mike Sobel could probably best speak to that. But our biggest concern here was not to have a windfall or a shortfall for any particular district. This particular concept would be just providing dollars where the kids are educated, but not in such a way that it would really influence anyone real negative or real positively while this is being phased in.
I think the only thing I would add to that, I mean, how this fair school funding plan would be phased in, I think is really a product of the budget process as well. I mean, we're kind of giving you an end game. How we get there over the next 6 or however many years, I think is going to depend a lot on the budget process. And it's tough for us to say exactly how that would work sitting here today.
Yeah, I think the intent is to protect everybody and not change policy, but Steve's right. Is, you know, some of those things are going to be based on how much money is available and what the priorities are in the legislature putting the budgets together over the next 6 years.
Well, and part of the process over the next 6 years falls on us in making sure that we hold the legislatures accountable to what they pass if they pass this.
Great point. Next question is, can you speak again to the impact of the pipeline appeal and the effect it will have on the formula?
Right now, just as there is not a current law, whether it's this formula or the old formula, there is not something in current law that will automatically say the value that should be used is the value that has not been appealed. That is not part of statute. It needs to probably be addressed in a temporary law type of provision for the upcoming budget because of the ongoing appeals from Nexus and from Rover. It's really outside of, in a way, it's outside of the funding formula because it's a different kind of discussion. But I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think it's something that needs to be addressed, but it's going to have to be addressed as part of the legislative process because it's not something that you're going to want in a permanent law because it gets to be very messy from an implementation standpoint.
Thank you. Next question. For districts that have an income tax on the books in addition to property tax, has this revenue been included in the simulations? Was some calculation done to convert this revenue into property taxes in order to compute total revenue?
No revenue, no local revenue is any part of any formula. The capacity to generate revenue is part of the formula, but the amount of revenue has never been a part of a funding formula in Ohio.
And I'm skipping over questions that are being answered in the chat as well. And I'm going to ask Callie just to make sure that we have a recording and transcript of the Q&A and chat function, so we can record, refine, and post these to the FAQ.
Yes, we'll be able to download everything submitted to the chat in the Q&A.
Jumping ahead, really, we're nearing the bottom of the chat because the Q&A they're getting answered right now. Is, do you know if DeWine has a position on this at this time, good or bad? I know that the work group members have not participated in those discussions with the sponsors. I know the sponsors are hard at work. More than 60 House of Representative members and approaching half of the Senate have signed on to the Fair School Funding Plan. And so I'm certain that there are conversations with governor and leadership there regarding how to make this a reality.
Yeah. And my understanding is that the sponsors have been in regular contact with the governor and the governor's staff. They are fully aware of the efforts that are going on. And I don't think any of us heard anything where they have negatively reacted to what is going on either through the work group or the associations or the fair funding group.
And then the last question we had, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention, Jared had mentioned holding future legislatures accountable to the formula. And I don't think we mentioned today about the Oversight Commission that is set up in the substitute House bill, consisting of legislators, school officials, and members of the public, to make sure that the formula is continuing to work, that it's being modified as necessary, that it's looking at and confirming that what we believe will work is working, and if it needs tweaks and different touches along the way, that we're making sure that happens.
Thank you. That's a great point. The next question is, will we get a detailed breakdown of the simulation calculations so we can replicate it? I know we did address that, and what we're going to do is take the Q&A received today and online and have a discussion with the sponsors about releasing additional details as we discussed before. The next question is, a district's column K amount in the simulation a pre or post amount related to column H state share percentage? Does anybody have the simulation handy? Jared or Mike, anyone else that we might have to post that answer if it's not knowing this time.
I'm looking at the simulation. State K is the state share percentage. I'm not sure, comparing it to what?
Is a district's column K amount in the simulation a pre or post amount related to column H?
Okay, hold on. I was looking at the wrong version, sorry. Column K is the current law, which would be kind of at the beginning what Steve went through, the calculation that Steve talked about and I think put in the chat. That is what is reflected in column K of the printout as far as for comparison. And what was the rest of the question, Ryan? I'm sorry.
Go back there. Hold on. Is a district's column K amount simulation a pre or post amount related to column H state share percentage? We might have to research that one and post on our FAQ.
Yeah, because column K is the...
I believe column K is the state share amount, so it would be a post.
It would be a post
calculation.
It's a post calculation, yes.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 more questions that were entered into the Q&A. Trying to tie out the simulation numbers to source data for what estimated Formula A net of transfers, what source data and what date of the SFPR are used.
That's kind of what Steve hinted at when he was talking about how we came across column I. When you use June number 2 data, that gets us as close as we can, because LSC, as he said, has used an inflated percentage on some of the community schools because of the scholarships, because of the increases that we have seen there. So it's not been possible for us to tie out completely, but June number 2 is where we've been able to get our closest balancing to.
Thank you. And then the last question, it may be a repeat, but during the phase-in, would money for open enrollment dollars and other students that are educated in a district other than where they live, such as community schools and the like, be phased in as well? I think that's a repeat. So we'll make sure to record that answer, get our subgroups to write up those answers and post online. So to Kevin, Katie, Will, and Callie, are there any Q&As or chats that I've missed? And while you're doing that, I do want to draw your attention to the last few slides before we open it up for closing. That in the next few days, right, there's going to be a lot of information released. We have statewide regional advocacy calls that I'm sure you've been notified of, and lots of resources available from our education associations. And we again appreciate their time in hosting these Q&As. Today, again, was designed so that you, the practitioner, could interact with the architects of this process over the last 3 years and see the depth of their time and volunteerism gone into the Fair School Funding Plan. We really appreciate their support, and I'm going to turn it over, I believe, to Katie Johnson for a wrap up.
Thank you, Ryan. And I think you actually wrapped us up quite well. The only thing I would add, Ryan, is that if you have additional questions, please continue to submit those questions using the link that we have provided. So, and thank you that there is the link, and we'll make sure that that is distributed along with the recording today. So thank you again on behalf of OASBO, BASA, and OSBA. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And thank you to the work group for all of their hard work over the last 3 years. So thank you so much, and hope to see everyone tomorrow at 11 o'clock for the regional meetings. Take care.
Thank you.